Hi everyone, welcome. Can you guys hear me? All right, now I can't see you. So welcome everyone to The Writer in the World with Jessica Hagedorn and Viet Thanh Nguyen. My name is Nita and I'm an assistant professor in Asian and Asian American Studies in the Center for Ethnic Studies here at BMCC. I'm also a co-director of Building Asian American Studies across the community college classroom, which is a year-long program. I'll talk about it a little bit. So we're really happy to host this event. It's actually our final event for the year, and it's part of the program, Building Asian American Studies across the community college classroom. And this is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, which I feel like we have to mention that like a month ago we were like, it's going to be defunded and it's going to disappear, but it's actually slated to get more money. And it's being housed, the grant is housed in the Ethnic Studies Center here. And so the program, Building Asian American Studies, I'm just going to abbreviate it because it's a really long name, right? Started with the Faculty Development Summer Institute last summer. And every month we've had a public event. And you can find out more information about the program in your program that you should have been handed when you came in. And so now I'm going to introduce our speakers for the event, Jessica Hagedorn and Viet Thanh Nguyen. Both authors are very accomplished, have very long bios, so just sit back for a bit, relax, right? All right, so Jessica Hagedorn is the author of novels, collections of poetry and prose, a playwright, and a screenwriter. Her first novel, Dog Eaters, won the American Book Award in 1990, and was a finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction in 1991. Her other novels include Toxicology, Dream Jungle, and The Gangster of Love. Jessica also adapted Dog Eaters and The Gangster of Love for the stage. Her collections of poetry and prose include Danger and Beauty and Burning Heart, A Portrait of the Philippines. Her plays include Most Wanted, Stairway to Heaven, and Faye in the Desert. And she also edited both volumes of Charlie Chan is Dead, and these are two volumes of Asian American fiction, and a lot of Asian American studies professors are really thankful that they're out there. She also edited Manila Noir. Jessica has received many, many awards, including the Guggenheim Fiction Fellowship, the Philippine National Book Award, and a Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Asian American Legal Defense Fund, the Asian American Writers Workshop, and Kundiman. And I just want to add a personal note that Dog Eaters came out when I was an undergrad, and I read it. And I was like, what is this thing called Asian American Studies? And a professor recommended it. And I was like, if this is Asian American Studies, then I'm totally in. And so it kind of, was one of the texts that set my life so long ago now. Viet Thanh Nguyen is the author of The Sympathizer and short story collection, The Refugees. His nonfiction works are Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War and Race, which is, quote, the critical bookend to the creative project whose fictional bookend is A Sympathizer, end quote, and Race and Resistance, Literature and Politics in Asian America. And that last book actually contains an analysis of the Dog Eaters, so it's like a lot of connections are going to happen here today. He's won multiple awards for The Sympathizer, including the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction last year, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, the Edward Award for Best Fiction Novel from the Mystery Writers of America. There are many more, so just keep relaxing. The Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction from the American Library Association, the first Nobel Prize from the Center for Fiction, and the Asian Pacific American Literature Award from the Asian Pacific American Librarian Association. He's also the Errol Arnold Chair of English and Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. He's been widely published in the popular press and been interviewed on the TV and radio. And I'm going to totally sound like one of those, I'm not going to read the book, I'm going to wait for the movie people. But his interviews, both audio and video interviews, I've found them to be great teaching topics, teaching materials, just to get discussions going on refugees, war, voice, and representation, among other things. And if you haven't read them already, his two recent pieces in the Times, Viet Thanh Nguyen reveals how writers' workshops can be hostile, and the Great Vietnam War novel was not written by an American, should check them out. So our moderator today is Professor Nita Noveno. She teaches in English here at BMCC, and she's also a co-director of Building Asian American Studies across the community college classroom. Nita is a founder of Sunday Salon, which is a prose reading series in New York. It started in New York, but now has spread to Chicago, Miami, and Fort Lauderdale. In 2007, Sunday Salon also launched an online magazine, and this mic is so sensitive. There's also a salon held every month here in New York City, so find her on Facebook maybe, I don't know. But go, they have like great authors come. And Nita herself is working on a memoir, she's a writer, and the memoir is about her family. So that's it for the very long intro. I'm just gonna briefly talk about the format. So there'll be 10 minutes of reading from Viet Nguyen, and then also Jessica's sick, right? She's not 100%, but she still came, which is amazing. So we're really thankful for that. And so in her place, as far as reading, Professor Laura Stapleton from English will read. And so 2 readings, about 10 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And then there's also a book signing in the bookstore after the talk, and books from both authors will be available there. I guess finally I should just say if your cell phones are on, turn them off or on vibrate, right? Thanks.
Hey there, Borough of Manhattan Community College. It's great to be here today. This is really sensitive. Oh, gosh. All right, so I'm going to read an excerpt from The Sympathizer. And for those of you who don't know what this novel is about, it's about a communist spy in the South Vietnamese army. It's April 1975. And his mission is to flee with the remnants of that army to the United States and spy on their efforts to take their country back. I guess I should backtrack. April 1975, I'm assuming 95% of you were not born at this time in this room. What happened was that the Vietnam War had happened. And April 1975, Saigon is about to fall or to be liberated, depending on your point of view. So he goes to the United States as this spy, and this really happened. There really was an effort by the South Vietnamese refugees to take Vietnam back and to do things like start the very first international pho restaurant chain in order to fund this revolution. And they came to a very bad end in Laos and Thailand. So he comes and he becomes a refugee. And one of the things he has to do, besides spying, because it doesn't pay any money, is to find a job. So the job that he gets after he gets out of the refugee camp in California, in Los Angeles, is to become the authenticity consultant on a movie that looks suspiciously like Apocalypse Now. But if Francis Ford Coppola were to ask, is not Apocalypse Now? I'm assuming that you actually have watched Apocalypse Now, which I have increasingly come to realize when I talk to college students cannot be taken for granted anymore. But when I was a refugee growing up in San Jose, California in the 1970s and 1980s, I watched Apocalypse Now. I was about 10 or 11. It was 1980 and 1981. And this new invention had happened. It's called the VCR. So we could do things like go to the video store and rent something called a video cassette and put it into the VCR and watch a movie. And after I watched Star Wars a dozen times, I watched Apocalypse Now. And it scarred me permanently. Because, I was a Vietnamese refugee, but I was also an American boy, and I liked war movies. I liked watching tanks and soldiers and things blowing up and everything like that. And I identified with the American soldiers as they wiped out the Nazis. Well, watching Apocalypse Now, I was rooting for the American soldiers up until the point they murdered all the Vietnamese people. And that put me in an impossible situation. Was I Vietnamese? Or was I American? Was I the one doing the killing, or was I the one being killed? So that was literally the moment when I felt myself split in two, psychically. I never forgot that. And so then when it came time to write The Sympathizer, I thought, cool, now I can take my revenge on Hollywood. Because Apocalypse Now was not unique. Apocalypse Now was one of only many movies about the Vietnam War that Hollywood made, and I being very precocious and curious about my history, watched almost every single one of those Vietnam War movies, which I don't recommend that anyone do. So this scene is when he has read the script for the movie that's going to be made about the Vietnam War and that's going to be shot in the Philippines. And he has given the director notes on this film. They're going to talk about it, and the director is known only as the auteur. My meeting with the auteur had gone on for a while longer, mostly in a more subdued fashion, with me pointing out that the lack of speaking parts for Vietnamese people in a movie set in Vietnam might be interpreted as cultural insensitivity. Do you not think it would be a little more believable, I said, a little more realistic, a little more authentic for a movie set in a certain country, for the people in that country to have something to say, instead of having your screenplay direct, as it does now, cut to villagers speaking in their own language? Do you think it might not be decent to let them actually say something, instead of simply acknowledging that there is some kind of sound coming from their mouths? Could you not even just have them speak a heavily accented English? You know what I mean, ching-chong English? Just to pretend they're speaking in an Asian language that somehow American audiences can strangely understand? You're a very tough audience. People are usually laughing at this point. You are a very, very tough audience. Okay. The auteur grimaced and said, "Very interesting. Great stuff. Loved it. But I had a question. What was it? Oh, yes. How many movies have you made?" That's better. None. Isn't that right? None. Zero. Zilch. Nada. Nothing. And however you say it, in your language. So thank you for telling me how to do my job. Now get the hell out of my house and come back after you've made a movie or two. Maybe then I'll listen to one or two of your cheap ideas. So since the novel has been published, I've had the occasion to meet several Hollywood people, and none of them dispute this characterization. I confess to being angry with the auteur. But was I wrong in being angry? This was especially the case when he acknowledged he did not even know that Montagnard was simply a French catch-all term for the dozens of Highland minorities. So the movie is called The Hamlet, and it's about American Green Berets who are sent into the Central Highlands of Vietnam to train the local people, the hill people, the tribes people, what the French called the Montagnards, train them to fight the Viet Cong. What if, I said to him, I wrote a screenplay about the American West and simply called all the natives Indians? You'd want to know whether the cavalry was fighting the Navajo or Apache or Comanche, right? Likewise, I would want to know, when you say these people are Montagnards, whether we speak of the Bru or the Nung or the Tay. Let me tell you a secret, the auteur said. Ready? Here it is. No one gives a shit. He was amused by my wordlessness. To see me without words is like seeing one of those Egyptian felines without hair, a rare and not necessarily desirable occasion. How could I be so dense? How could I be so deluded? I naively believed that I could divert the Hollywood organism from its goal, the simultaneous lobotomization and pickpocketing of the world's audiences. Hollywood did not just make horror movie monsters, it was its own horror movie monster, smashing me under its foot. I had failed, and the auteur would make the Hamlet as he intended, with my countrymen serving merely as raw material for an epic about white men saving good yellow people from bad yellow people. I pitied the French for their naivete in believing they had to visit the country in order to exploit it. Hollywood was much more efficient imagining the countries it wanted to exploit. I was maddened by my helplessness before the auteur's imagination and machinations. His arrogance marked something new in the world, for this was the first war where the losers would write history instead of the victors, courtesy of the most efficient propaganda machine ever created, with all due respect to Joseph Goebbels and the Nazis, who never achieved global domination. Hollywood's high priests understood innately the observation of Milton's Satan, that it was better to rule in hell than serve in heaven, better to be villain, loser, or anti-hero than virtuous extra, so long as one commanded the bright lights of center stage. In this forthcoming Hollywood trompe-l'oeil, all the Vietnamese of any side would come out poorly, herded into the roles of the poor, the innocent, the mute, or the corrupt, the evil or the corrupt. Our fate was not to be merely mute. We were to be struck dumb. Thank you.
So it is an honor to be asked to read on behalf of Jessica, and this is from a chapter in Dog Eaters called His Mother the Whore. There are those who say my poor whore of a mother sold me to uncle for 50 pesos. So Nita, desperate, half crazy, unable to feed me and herself those last few months. They say she was still young and still beautiful. They shake their heads solemnly at the terrible waste. I'm not sure they're telling the whole truth. Maybe she was more ordinary than they remember, an ordinary whore with a ravaged face. They describe how she jumped in the river, a watery grave, black with human shit, every dead thing and piece of garbage imaginable, the rotting carcasses of wild dogs and cats, enormous rats with heads blown off by bullets, broken tree branches, and the tangled bouquets of wilted banana leaves, palm fronds, and calachuchi flowers. When they pulled out my mother's blue corpse, they say her long black hair was entwined in this mass of slimy foliage and decay, a gruesome veil of refuse dragging on the mud beneath her. This is what they tell me. This is what I've chosen to believe. They say Sanaida's ghost still haunts the section of the river, a mournful apparition in the moonlight. Boy claims he's seen her more than once, but I don't believe him. Sanaida. She was a legendary whore, my mother, disgraced and abandoned, just like in the movies, driven to take her own life. My father was not the first man to promise her anything. That much I know for sure. Uncle identified her bloated body, arranged for her pauper's burial. That's why I owe him. No one knew her last name, what province she came from, if she had any other family besides me. They say I was 5 or 6 years old, that I was mute for months after her death. I was so dark, small, and thin, they called me Gagamba, little spider. I went home with Uncle and never shed a tear. I don't want to remember anything else about my sad whore of a mother. I've heard enough. That's why I never ask Uncle. That's why he never brings her up. He started me doing odd jobs on the street. I sold cigarettes, boiled peanuts, chiclets, sampaguita garlands, the Metro Manila Daily, and movie magazines. Legitimate little things that never got me anywhere. I had to compete with all the other kids on the street, running up to cars and buses, pestering tourists, hawking our wares. I hated every minute of it. Then there were times when Uncle pretended he was crippled and blind. I would lead him up to the air-conditioned Toyotas and Mercedes-Benzes, where rich people and foreigners sat with their doors locked, trying hard to ignore my outstretched hand at their windows. But Uncle had no patience and little time for begging. That's for lazy people, he would say. When I was 7, Uncle taught me to steal. I was wiry, fast, and fearless, a natural talent, according to him. More daring than Boy Boy, who was 2 years older than me and cried all the time. I was one of the best pickpockets in Manila. Just ask anyone around here. Ask Uncle. I enjoyed stealing, the heady rush that hit me as I disappeared into a crowd, stolen goods burning in my hand. A ring, a watch, a chain around someone's neck. The money sometimes still warm from someone's back pocket. A heady rush of triumph like dope, a pleasure so private, delicious, and powerful, I never once got caught. That's how good I was. I would do anything for Uncle in those days. We all would, grateful orphans who earned our keep, eager to please and turn our loot over to Uncle. I was the youngest and the smartest, Uncle's favorite. What they say about me and Uncle isn't true. Just as Boy and Carding, or Chito, at that dress shop in Mabini where he works. The only thing about Uncle is he made things possible. He taught me everything I know. Thank you.
Is this working? Oh, it is. Thank you, Laura. That was Professor Laura Stapleton from the English department who read for Jessica Hagedorn. Would you give her another round of applause, please? That was fantastic. So we are now in the where I get to ask these wonderful writers questions portion. But before we begin, I just want to let everyone know that we have books for sale in the bookstore right next door, and we'll have a book signing as well. Welcome, both of you. It's truly an honor to have you both on the stage. And Jessica, I'm so glad you could make it because you're feeling under the weather.
I texted Viet that I'd never heard him read from his novels, his stories, his fiction. So, I had to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
I'm delighted that you could make it because I want to share my story. Linda talked about how she read Dog Eaters when she was an undergraduate, and I don't remember whether I was an undergraduate or graduate student, but it was right on the cusp. And Dog Eaters was still in hardcover, so I shelled out money for hardcover, at that time. And
all $5 of it back then.
No, it was I'm sure it was 20, well, whatever it was. It was a lot of money for a student.
It was.
Yeah. And I was like, wow, this is awesome. This is a novel of a kind that I hadn't ever seen before, whether it's Asian American literature or something else, and it just made such a huge impact on me that I had to write about it. So there is half a chapter on your.
I'm so happy you could be here with us. He's here as part of the Penn Festival. So
that's right.
It's great that it could all come together.
Absolutely.
Really.
So let me ask you I was going to go straight to the juicy questions. Let me ask the first juicy question. You have parallel themes of identity and belonging and not belonging, or being other, or the outsider, war, colonialism, and love running through your novels. The main character and narrator in The Sympathizer has a dual identity, as you described earlier in your fantastic reading. As a Vietnamese man of mixed descent, spoiler alert for those who are still reading it, as a child of a Vietnamese mother and a French Catholic priest father, a communist spy and immigrant, he is a man of two worlds. Jessica, you've described yourself as a hybrid because of your mixed heritage, and you identify as Filipina and American. You, as well as your characters, are of many worlds. How does your identity influence your writing and the characters you create?
Well, I think it has to do with my abiding interest and curiosity. I think Viet shares this too, and why we sort of came up with the writer in the world as a possible title for this particular conversation. I'm interested in everything because I feel like I'm connected to everything, and my empathy is larger than, my own relationships within my family or my friends, my community, my own culture, all the cultures I belong to, because there's also the artist culture, which is everywhere, right? So it just sort of is. I think every artist is sort of belonging to that other world. Anyway, that's what Adonis says, you know. I asked him about that yesterday. The other is me.
Adonis, the poet that you interviewed for one of the Penn events.
And I think we made ourselves sicker. Yeah, because he was ill, I was ill. But he says it's a very controversial thing for the Arab world to have him say that, the creative people have their own world, one world.
Well, for me, going back to that moment of being a refugee boy in San Jose in the late 70s, early 80s, I felt split in two, as I said, watching Apocalypse Now, but I was already split in two, in a sense, because I felt like a spy. I felt like I was a spy in my parents' household because they were these Vietnamese people speaking a Vietnamese language, eating Vietnamese food, which I thought was very strange, and all these strange Vietnamese customs, and I was an American spying on them. And then I would step out of the household into the rest of the American world, and I would feel like I was a Vietnamese spying on them and their strange American customs. So that was the emotional core, eventually, for becoming a writer, but then also for this figure of the spy and the sympathizer. I have a very boring life, so I had to do something with the emotional core. I didn't want to no one wants to read my autobiography, okay? I'll just let you know that from the beginning. But so I thought I could make it more interesting if I wrote about it as a spy. And I think the other impulse to become a writer was that my parents ran probably the second Vietnamese grocery store in San Jose in the late 70s, early 80s, and it was a rough time. And I remember as a boy walking down the street where their store was located, and in another window I saw a sign that said, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese." And even at that young age, I knew that there was a story in that sign, and that story didn't include my parents, didn't include me, and as a matter of fact, excluded people like us. And that was an early sense for me of how powerful stories were, and how stories were not just found in literature, for example, but were found in the stories that we've told about America or our country or community, whatever. And the role of the writer in the world was to make an intervention and change that story, which is what I wanted to do.
Great segue into my next question, which is about the writer in the world. Actually, in the June 21st, 2016 New York Times article, Viet, your quote is saying about your novel, "There are no conventional happy endings here. Conventional happy endings are the property of Hollywood, and that's propaganda for the American dream. I don't believe in that." Let's talk about lies, truth, and the Trump administration. Since you were quoted in this New York Times article last summer, it seems that propaganda for the American dream might have influenced the election. What role should literature have now in commenting on the American dream for those who so steadfastly believe in it?
I think literature just needs to continue doing what it does. I think you can't, this has been going on forever. This is not new, what's happening to us right now. And humanity, goes through this over and over again in different degrees and in terrible ways. And except now I think we're a lot more affected moment to moment because of the internet, and everything is so immediate that you feel like you're just living all the suffering, and you know too much. But this has been going on all our lives, I have really strong feelings of not jumping through hoops for dictators. At the same time, you address it in the work, in the way it feels most organic, Otherwise, you become an issue-driven writer or poet, and I think that's kind of bad writing. But did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Kind of? Yeah. That's my strong feeling about it, but I don't know, you might have a...
Well, I said I saw that sign, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese," and now when I hear "Make America Great Again," I think there's a straight connection.
Sure.
One story leads to the next story, because "Make America Great Again" means let's make America great again before Viet got here.
Right.
Right? That was when America was great, before the refugees showed up, before the colored immigrants showed up. Let's go back to that other time. And so so, the role of writers is, again, to contest the story, to point out that there is a story underlying Make America Great Again, and that our literature is a different story. And part of how we do that is simply through the nature of literature and art. Right now, the literary world, bless its heart, is all up in arms against Donald Trump, because now they're finally getting politicized because they see Donald Trump as a mortal threat to what it is that literature does. Because what Donald Trump does, how he's appealing, is that he asks us to empathize with a very small portion of the American population. He contracts empathy, and literature is about expanding empathy, right? So that's where the mortal conflict comes in. So that's one of the things that literature does. But beyond that, beyond the humanizing and humanistic part of literature, which is important, but not the only thing that literature does,
Yes.
there is the contestation of Make America Great Again. That's why, when I said that, in that quote that you have there, I was speaking very directly about the fact that my novel, The Sympathizer, doesn't end the way that almost all American readers will want it to end, whether they know it or not. Okay? The novel is about a communist spy who comes to the United States and gets disillusioned with communism. Americans are used to this narrative. They expect that the final act is he will abandon communism and start to eat apple pie and drink Coca-Cola. Okay? America's great, awesome. Right. And the novel refuses to do that. And I think American assumptions that the American story will always end in the American dream is so strong that a lot of readers are taken by surprise when they get to the end of the book. And that's part of what literature has to do too, is to challenge our very deep set
To
assumptions.
surprise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the theme of this event, The Writer in the World, in fact, Jessica, you said, in fact, I think I mentioned, one of the ideas was love in something, right? And you're like, no, let's make it The Writer in the World.
Terrible.
So thank you. How do you view your role as writers in the world, especially in our current post-election, I mean, this is connected to the last question, especially in our current post-election climate and the changes in politics around the world. I know we're going through, something that happens cyclically. In the US, Europe, and the Philippines, what does it take to be an artist, a writer in today's world, and how has it changed from when you first both started writing? I know there's a series of questions there, so answer any or all.
Well, for me, I think it's also age. It feels more urgent, but it's always been rather urgent because I started writing. I always wanted to be a writer, even, as a child in the Philippines. I knew that was my path, and I love stories and all that. So, that was always a dream of mine. So, but coming to America at the age of 14, I mean, the 60s were a terrible time, a turbulent time, also a wonderful time culturally. There was so much going on, but there was also a lot of struggle, and certainly the war, among many other wars. But the war you and I anyway, that's another conversation. But so I don't want to forget that this is not new. That I think we're always writing against, we're always writing for and against. On some level as artists. And we're also contemplating, and we're also, it's a fight. To write is to fight. In different ways to me. And I think that it continues, but I also feel within me a much more active sense of urgency. I feel like the time is now and do these things. Even that conversation yesterday was very meaningful to me, because of who this poet was and, what his country is going through right now. So that conversation was important to have in a public space.
Can you tell us about this poet that you interviewed yesterday?
Adonis is considered the greatest living poet of the Arab world. He's Syrian. He now lives in France in exile. He's 87 years old, so it's a huge, I always think, and he looked fragile, and you just think, well, is this the last time? And I was thinking about few years ago for the Penn Festival speaking to Galeano, Eduardo Galeano, and he died shortly after that conversation. And he was a great, Latin American writer. And the same thing, very active, very political, very engaged in the entire planet. It wasn't just about his travails. And I think that that's what I mean about writing in the world, that it's not our private war, it's about the bigger picture. Yeah?
Well, like I said, I find it great that now many American writers are upset about the situation today and find a sense of urgency and so on. But where were they 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? It's not as if there weren't crises at all those particular moments. It just wasn't a crisis that affected them. So they never saw themselves as engaged writers, committed writers, writers of the world. Whereas my whole inception as a writer was to be, I wasn't so pretentious as to think I was a writer of the world when I was like 19, but I thought I want to be a political writer. I think that literature has a role to play in shaping our world, right? The world shapes literature, and literature shapes the world. There's a dynamic there, and I wanted to be, a part of this genealogy of the writers who tried to make a difference not only on the page, but in connecting what was happening on the page to the rest of the world as well. And so I thought, for me, it's always been a political task to be a writer. Always been a writerly task to be a writer, and those of us who see the world in that way and see our art in that way are always getting ready, I think, right? Because no one would have cared about my opinion 20 years ago, right? So now when this moment happens and people care about my opinion, I have an opinion to give, but it's not a new opinion. I would have said the same thing 20 years ago.
Right,
but the point is you get yourself ready so that you're ready for the next emergency, not on the assumption that there's never going to be an emergency. So all these writers who are politicized now, I hope they stay politicized 5 years from now or 10 years from now, and don't just sort of think, okay, so Trump has been impeached, or Trump is no longer president, and Chelsea Clinton is president, and we don't have to worry about anything anymore, and we can continue to write about divorce and cancer. Yeah, I'm just making up a not impossible scenario. Yeah.
Nothing's impossible.
As we have seen.
Yes. Ditto. I mean, I feel too that every moment is political. I mean, I think maybe we should also explore what that means. I mean, I don't mean political as in politician necessarily, but that the choices we make, in our lives and what we try to, how we live, and so it's not just, yes, the act of writing, the act of making art is political and expressing ourselves. And what are you talking about on the, yeah.
Can I ask a question now of Jessica? Since we've talked about Dog Eaters, I mean, when I've read Dog Eaters, I thought this is a political novel. And it was a political novel in its content because it was dealing with politics in the Philippines, but it was a political novel in the way that it was written. I'm wondering if you can talk about that. Did you see it as a political novel in the way that it was written as well? Because
yes.
And how? Or how did you conceive of that?
Well, I wanted it to capture the madness, and I felt like the political was also the fact that it was not written in the comfortable linear narrative that most people were used to in terms of a novel, and I was not interested in doing that. So even the artistic choices I made of attempting to capture the culture by including news items and gossip and radio melodramas as part of the grand picture. My editor was really nervous and thought that I was really shooting myself in the foot. And I trust my readers. I mean, I feel people can rise to, I think people are smarter than most people give them credit for, and they like to dumb things down, and I thought, no, this is precisely the point of this book. And the title is so, has gotten me in a lot of trouble, so I had to stand by that on some level too.
And it's still a unique novel because people still don't write that way. You know what I'm saying? Like, the novel Dog Eaters is opposed, as you were saying, to conventions of literary realism and and straight narrative and all that kind of stuff. But people still do that. That's still kind of the
But there
dominant
are
mode.
writers, I mean, it came from a tradition. I mean, I felt like, excuse me, I'm having this, like, whatever this is, from what country, these throat things, so I'm, chewing on them. What set me free to write that novel? And I'd like to know what got you to wrestle with yours, which I love The Sympathizer. I mean, I also thought it was very funny.
Thank you.
It's a funny book. And filled with irony, which I love. But for a long time, I kept trying to write the novel, right? Set in the Philippines, the story I wanted to tell, and the kind of characters I wanted to create. And it kept being terrible. And I thought, what is wrong with this, And I was trying to make a very proper novel out of an improper narrative. And I looked to other writers. Finally, I don't know even why, I said, who's going to inspire me in a way? And I learned from certain writers how to do that, to break that kind of linear way of thinking. And once I did that, it was like the key. So I'd like to know what gave you the key.
Well, I always wanted to be a fiction writer, and my first stab at it was writing novels, very bad novels. Not that I ever got very far, but I remember, one time sitting down thinking, I really like The Dog Eaters, and I'd like to try to use that method, because I understood, at least intellectually, what the method was in my own fiction. I wrote 5 really bad pages, 10 really bad pages, and I thought, I'm not ready for this. I can't do this yet. And so then I wrote short stories, and it took me 17 years to write a short story collection, and that's how I learned how to write. And those short...
So is Refugees?
Yeah, The Refugees.
Posters?
The Refugees came out second, but
I also
wrote it first.
recommend.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
But I taught myself how to write through writing the stories in The Refugees, and since I didn't know how to write, I just imitated what I could see and what moved me, and that was basically conventional literary realism, middlebrow literary realism, and to write a short story in that fashion is really hard to do.
Short stories are tough.
They're really, well, I thought, they're short. It shouldn't take me very long to write this. It took me 17 years. But, what was also wrapped up in that aesthetic was also something political, which was my attempt to humanize Vietnamese people through these stories. And even as I did that, I knew that I was insufficiently ambitious, politically and theoretically, because I knew that to say that I wanted to humanize Vietnamese people meant that I was conceding a huge amount of territory to dominant culture, because I was proceeding from the assumption that I had to prove our humanity to somebody. If you come from a dominant class, if you come from privilege of whatever kind, you never have to prove your humanity. You just take it for granted. Jonathan Franzen never has to prove his humanity. He assumes everybody knows he's a human being. But a minority of whatever background, not just racial, a minority oftentimes lives in a state of anxiety. Like, the majority doesn't know who I am, I have to prove my humanity. So I finished The Refugees, and I thought, I'm not going to do that again. And that was the birth of The Sympathizer. I thought, I'm going to write a novel that is not going to attempt to prove humanity, that's going to take humanity for granted, and it's going to be so comfortable in taking that humanity for granted that I was going to actually foreground the inhumanity of my protagonist, because he does some dastardly things in this novel. But that is a privilege that the majority can take for themselves. Like, Francis Ford Coppola can make Apocalypse Now, American soldiers do terrible, terrible things, but no one goes around thinking, all Americans are evil. Maybe some people do, but most people don't. They think, that's just humanity. Humanity means we're complex, we do inhuman things. And that's actually really interesting. And I wanted to claim that interestingness for my own novel.
I think, I don't know how many young people here take creative writing classes, but, a lot of times we all make the same sort of steps, right, into writing, where we feel like everybody has to be lovable and, heroic and all this stuff that's not interesting in the least. And you just write it. I mean, I love when your character, the narrator, who's unnamed, in The Sympathizer, when he is forced to do something, which I won't spoil. And we get it. It's the tragedy of it. I mean, I think that's what we're supposed to feel this. Oh my God, you know, he's driven to do that. I get it. And he's still a human being, you know, but it's also because of how you wrote it. And I think you trusted yourself, you know?
Right, and I think what you said, that, you know, we shouldn't underestimate our readers is absolutely right. And I think readers, I mean, a certain number of readers, not all readers, but a certain number of readers can rise to the challenge of a challenging work. And you have to trust yourself, and you have to trust the reader. I think that's what you said you did in Dog Eaters, and that leaves a mark. That leaves
Well,
an
who's your
imprint.
reader? I always say it's me. My main reader is myself. I mean, I'm writing for myself. So if I can trust myself and my openness, then I think I can give that to the people who might pick up my book, you know? I mean, you can't control it anyway. So make the movie you want and write the book you want. That's...
Yeah, I think with the refugees, I was writing for other people.
We're never going to let you
Yeah.
talk.
Yeah, but by the time I really sympathized with it, I had your position. I was like, "Fuck it, I'm going to write for me," you know.
Fuck it,
and
right.
that was great. It was incredibly liberating. I had a great time. The only time I was worried was when my agent talked to me, and I was like, "Oh my God, am I going to sell this novel or not?" That was the only time that I got worried in writing the novel, thinking about other people. Yeah, but
You're answering all the questions that already that I was going to pose you. So you guys
Well,
can
jump
keep
in.
All right, so there was a question on audience. Just because you mentioned it, why don't I go ahead and ask you, are you thinking about audience as you are writing? Like, who exactly do you have in mind as you are writing? Maybe they're different for the different works. And does it change from before, during, and after the audience for you?
I think it's everything. I mean, I think you don't think about them and you do think about them. Because, I mean, you're not also just writing for yourself. Even when I say I'm my first reader, I mean, I have to approve what I'm doing, right? And kind of feel good about it and trust my taste and my instincts. But at the same time, I know what that field is. I've been around long enough. I know there are people who will misinterpret, and I know there are people who will hate it. And that's okay. I think what I learned pretty young is, especially on the Dog Eaters tour, where there were people who were really pissed off. And they would just come in my face, and I would be like, oh. And then I thought, well, I'm sorry. You know, I'm sorry, you know, you're so unhappy. This is the book I wrote. And, you know, in a way, I realized, oh, I can't change them. And that's okay. And you don't have to buy my book. Don't buy it. The title bugs you. Don't buy it. It's like I realized it was like this big illumination, you know. And of course, things hurt. I can't say that, you know, when somebody totally doesn't get it or they write something nasty that it just slides off me. You know, never believe somebody when they say that. And it's very hard to avoid reviews. I mean, people say, I never read my reviews. Well, people send them to you, you know, yeah, right. And, you know, you just have to go, okay, this is the world. And, you know, there are angry people and there are people who...
World on social media now, too. So
Right.
It's like
Well, that
amplified.
I do avoid that because... But I hear you're very active.
much too active. I was writing about, you know, minivans yesterday. Not actually a really productive use of my time.
Yeah, no, I don't do that. But did you want to add to this question, the audience?
Yeah, no, audience is very
readers?
important because, you know, like I said, I wrote the novel for me, but beyond that, my first audience beyond that was Vietnamese people, and then beyond that was everybody else. And it was a very deliberate choice because, you know, my feeling is that in the United States, basically probably everywhere, if you're a minority, you're expected to write for the majority because the majority controls everything. They control the literary industry, for example, 87% white in New York City, literary industry. So that inevitably shapes how literature is written, how literature is produced, and the easiest way to get published in New York City in a major publishing house is to write for white people. Fact. Right. Now, if you're not white and you know implicitly or explicitly that that's what's going to be expected, it's going to transform your literature. So go back to the Jonathan Franzen example. Jonathan Franzen's already white. Okay, so he can say, for example, I'm eating a delicious sandwich. And you know exactly what a sandwich is. I say, I'm eating a delicious bowl of pho, and I'd have to say, 10 years ago, comma, a delicious beef noodle soup, comma. I have to translate. That's the expectation for the minority writer. Translate, be the ambassador, be the go-between,
But you don't have to.
But you don't have to.
Right.
But I'm saying it's very tempting
Right.
for a lot of people to do that, and obviously not in something so blunt as that.
Right.
But I can
Oh, I know,
detect
I know.
when a book is written for first people not of that particular group, but for the majority, okay? It can be done in subtle ways, but it can still be
Right.
done.
Right.
And so with the sympathizer, I thought, I'm going to write for Vietnamese people, and I'm going to make everybody else listen in, because people for the majority are not used to doing that. They're used to having books and stories addressed to them. And so that's why the sympathizer is written as a confession from one Vietnamese person to another Vietnamese person, so it's built in what that level of expectation is.
Well, then that maybe brings me to this question of language, because Jessica, you bring in Filipino language. I don't recall that much Vietnamese in the sympathizer. So let me just read my question. Jessica, you said in an interview for Bomb Magazine Online, 1991, it's best if you go out in the world knowing more than one language. I don't care what the language is. It's good for your brain to dream in another language. It gives you a clue, another perspective, a way of understanding, some compassion for other people, even if it's just because you know how to joke in another language. Can you talk about your choices to include or not include different languages in your stories? You just said about writing for the Vietnamese audience, so
Has it been translated?
Yeah.
It's in the process of being translated.
Did you work with a translator?
No, I mean, there's some translators who ask me questions, but not the Vietnamese translators, and they're only halfway through right now.
Right.
But, it's a very tricky thing because, already Vietnamese people are telling me, you better make sure they get the language right because there's different dialects, the language changes after 1975, things like that. But in my case, because the fiction is that it is a confession written from one Vietnamese person to another Vietnamese person, it's written in Vietnamese. So you don't have to put Vietnamese into that, right? So it's that even though you're reading it all in English, it's supposed to be all in another language.
Okay.
Yeah.
But when it's being translated, we had this convoluted conversation yesterday. I love it. I think I tortured everybody with this question. But so here it is. You intended it to be written in Vietnamese in English, right? So, and then now they're translating it so that the people who would rather read it in Vietnamese. So are you working with, for example, I can see where a poet like Adonis would want to work with a poet translator because it's about rhythm and all these things. And did you have a choice of translators?
Yeah, I mean, they offered me some names, and I said, okay, well, let me think about it. But then the point is that I don't really know this world of Vietnamese literary translation. So my stopgap measure was that I have a Vietnamese American poet/translator who's going to vet the manuscript that the Vietnamese people send me.
Good. That's good.
And so, I mean, you were asking about language. Even though Vietnamese doesn't appear in the book, I think the fact that I can at least speak some Vietnamese and I was raised in that language had an impact on writing in English, because I was extremely, I guess all writers are aware of language, but I felt like I was extra attentive to the language in the book for two reasons. And one is that as an Asian American writer, is one of my identities, not my only identity, as Asian Americans, we're, I think, oftentimes aware that we're perceived as being foreign and that our foreignness is associated with not being able to speak English. And so, at least for me as an Asian American writer, and I know for some other Asian American writers, there's tremendous anxiety around whether or not we can write English. And we have to prove it. We have to demonstrate maybe to excessive lengths that we can write in English. So that's what I did. But also the fact that I could look at English from the outside, from the perspective of someone who knew another language, meant that I was trying to alienate both myself and readers, English language readers, from the language. I mean, many people have said to me, gosh, I had to use a dictionary to read your book. Thank God we live in the age of computers. I can just click on it and find the word, And I was like, well, good for you. I expanded your English vocabulary. But that was very deliberate. To bend every sentence that I possibly could to make people aware of what the language itself was doing, and not to have the language be transparent.
So wonderfully done.
Yeah. I wonder if you had to, do you feel there's a different persona writing as a scholar in that kind of language that is expected of scholars and critics, as opposed to writing as creative. It's both creative, so I don't want to say that. As an artist, writing as an artist, just writing a story.
Well, yeah, they're very, very different, my challenge was to try to write a novel that was critical, and that took everything I knew as an academic, all the theory and stuff, philosophy, whatever, and make it entertaining. So there's a lot of complicated theory in the novel that hopefully is easy to read, because I don't, just give it to people straight. I try to enact it, and then as a critic and a scholar, I try to take everything I know from writing fiction and make my criticism hopefully more interesting.
Yeah.
Right?
You did it.
Thank you.
I'll
But you haven't answered the question about, because reading the dog eater.
I'm
dog
sorry,
eaters,
what's the
and
question?
The question about translation of
About
language.
about your choices of, using
Tagalog, Spanish.
maybe different languages in your stories.
Well, I mean, that's the Philippines, and that's I grew up in a house where a lot of languages were always going on at the same time, and it would be like almost in the same sentence, my mother might say, start in English and move into Spanish and then go into Tagalog because it just made more sense. And that music was always in my head, and I loved it. And I thought, how will I capture it? How can I give a taste of this? And so I just used it where it felt natural. There was, my editor was, she was great. I have to say, she was open, but she also said, do you want to put a thing in the back? I said, oh my God, no. I said, I hate those novels where there's a glossary. I said, no, I think that's my job to just, people will get it in some way. And if they don't get it, then I failed.
It was great, because I didn't get it. You didn't translate the Spanish or the Tagalog, and I didn't know what was. But you just go with the flow.
Go with the flow, and the humor will come out or something. I wanted to trust that and not clutter it up. And then I turned to her one day when this is back in the day of real editing, personally, going to the office, which they don't do now. It's all emails right? Who was your editor, by the way?
Peter Blackstock. You're very young.
Did you work with him?
Oh, yeah, but we use Microsoft Word track changes.
See what I mean? But I actually, she'd send me the stuff with all her little notes and flags and things. And so on the thing about language, she said, well, you sure you don't want to, somehow have some kind of explanation? I said, no. And I said, think of all the novels I've had to read where suddenly a whole, I read all these like wacky novels, right? And there'll be French in there suddenly or German, and nobody's, translating it for me. They're just assuming I'm so educated, I'm going to know what this means. So it was my revenge.
Yeah. Yes. I'm going to bring this back to the epic war film that is in both of your novels, which you talked about in your introduction. Apocalypse Now, which is loosely based on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness.
But how many students here have seen it?
Yeah, maybe you can. Yeah. Oh. We could have.
I don't think those are the students raising their hands.
Yeah.
I know everybody
Good eyes.
is so young now. And
for Jessica, the title of the film in your Dream Jungle was Napalm Sunset.
Yeah.
And the movie director, his name is Tony Pierce. And again, for the sympathizer, he was just known as the auteur. This is Francis Ford Coppola, the director. And then the movie is entitled The Hamlet. It's an American movie about the Vietnam War that was filmed in the Philippines using Filipino extras playing Vietnamese. So here everyone is an extra of the American Empire.
There were actually Vietnamese playing Vietnamese.
Oh,
There
Russian
were
Vietnamese.
Vietnamese refugees playing.
Oh, there were. Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
That's
That
right.
was the irony.
That's right. While the white actors are the center of the story, maybe you can talk about this. Circle back and talk about this movie in your work and how it affected your life and your writing. It actually started this summer when we had that conversation.
what did we say?
Well, you were talking about how you had family members who were extras in the movie.
Not family members, but my really good friends. A lot of people I know have never gotten over that movie because they were extras or they were set people. They hired a lot of local artists to help build the sets, and they played the corpses. Remember the scene where all the heads are? Those are some of my friends, and they were the set builders, but they needed dead bodies, so they said, get in here. So they did, and we've had many drunken nights talking about that movie in the Philippines, going over the weird irony of all of it. It's so delicious. And do you know that there's oh my God, there are children, street children, who have, it's like a colony or something. Somebody was telling me of people who were all fathered by some of the actors or some of the crew, or, because they would be living for months at a time in various locations and the villages and stuff. And so these kids have grown up, of course, and they've become sort of these, I was like, I have to visit this village, wherever this is. Not celebrities, but some weird haunting or something. It's some weird, like, they're of that movie that's become almost, it is a legend. And it was a legend for us who've lived through that and kind of seen it. And I don't know, for the young people now, seeing it must be quaint. I don't know. It's effective, though. It's weirdly effective. It's weirdly effective. The boat stuff still upsets me, and
I think it's actually a very powerful work of art, so I wanted to both acknowledge that it was a powerful work of art by putting it.
That's why we write about it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I also wanted to take it down at the same time.
Of course. Take it down.
And I think, Francis Ford Coppola can take it. He's like a millionaire.
Oh, no. It has nothing to do with that.
Difference.
Yeah. No, you have to sort of take it down because it's a really powerful movie, and at the same time screws up royally where it could have. But then it also shows you his interest in it. He's interested in one point of view, his point of view. He wasn't interested in what the natives were saying. They're there as a something allegory. I hate Heart of Darkness too, by the way. Am I the only person who? There's some interesting passages, but I read that and I go, what?
I think my students would probably agree with that.
I'm not crazy about his writing. I keep thinking, am I missing something? The writing itself? What Nita? It's another subject.
I really like Heart of Darkness.
I love the title. It's a great title. I wish I'd thought of it. It's so like deep and it could mean so many things. But the writing itself.
It's dense.
I can do dense, but no. Turgid? What does that mean? I know you know. Heavy.
English professors.
Something. For me, huh? So I was always like, I'm missing it. And then the natives, really.
Yes, I agree.
Okay.
It's a racist portrayal.
Well, it's just like he didn't have the ear. I don't know if he really was a racist, but it was just ridiculous. Ridiculous.
The film.
The film.
Heart of Darkness, Apocalypse Now.
If you read the bibliography, not the acknowledgments of the sympathizer, you'll see that I read every single book that was written about Francis Ford Coppola or Apocalypse Now.
Yes.
But at the same time, the movie in the novel, The Hamlet, is actually a compilation of the entire Vietnam War genre.
Platoon.
All these movies are in there, especially the Green Berets, for example. And so when I wrote the novel, I knew that I was going to put this long scene in there. And I think it was partially inspired by Dog Eaters and Dream Jungle, but also by Tropic Thunder. You're much more likely to have seen Tropic Thunder, for example, than Apocalypse Now.
Reaction.
Yeah. No, the first 6 minutes of Tropic Thunder is brilliant. The rest of the movie sucks. You don't have to watch it, but the first 6 minutes are brilliant. And I wanted to gesture at that because I wanted to use this excuse. I mean, I have to say, some people have accused me of the novel of just like going off the rails at this point. Like, oh, did he have to do this? It just doesn't seem like it fits into the plot and everything. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but I had to do it. I had to do it. And I had to do it because it was fun. It was a lot of fun to write it, to satirize the entire Hollywood film industry. Because as you hopefully heard in the passage that I read, my argument in putting that film in there is to say that the Hollywood cinema industrial complex is the unofficial ministry of propaganda for the military industrial complex, and that's the function that it serves. And everything that happens in the film sequence is a foreshadowing of everything that's going to happen at the end of the novel when things really get real in terms of war and blood and violence and everything like that. And so it was a satirical moment, and it serves as comic relief, but also as the moment where I could explicitly introduce a lot of that theoretical stuff. I mean, there's all these references, to like post-colonial critique, Marxist critique, that is happening in this sequence.
The horror. That's brilliant.
Then the horror.
That was brilliant.
I say it all the time.
Yeah.
I'm feeling it right now.
There's a reference to Apocalypse Now and to Heart of Darkness. There's multiple layers of illusion.
And Marlon Brando, I have a soft spot for Marlon Brando, but I one thing I want to say is I actually don't think Coppola set out to make a propaganda film. I think he was enticed by the material and the grandeur of it, and that he was trying to do something different. That's why when he doesn't take the time, because of his arrogance, it's more I don't expect anything from Tropic of Thunder or the Green Berets. To me, that's just they're doing the usual. But you want something. I think he thought he was actually being the auteur.
So, yeah, some people have said, you don't give Francis Ford Coppola enough credit. And
no, you don't have to give him credit, but I think it's a different film than those other films.
The Hamlet is actually probably much more, the story of the Hamlet is actually much more based on the original draft of Apocalypse Now, which was written by John Milius, who was like more of this hardcore right-wing filmmaker, and then Francis Ford Coppola came in, and that's when he brought in Heart of Darkness. But I think the point I was making is that I think Coppola did think he was making an anti-war movie, right? And yet, this is an anti-war movie in which all the Vietnamese have to die and don't get a speaking part. Same problem with Heart of Darkness. It may be an anti-imperialist novella, but the black people have no role in there except to, say ooga booga or something.
Ooga booga all the time.
Okay. So the point is this. I mean, the point is that what is being satirized is not really. The point is that good intentions are not enough. Making an anti-war movie, oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's when you clap. Okay. Making an anti-war movie that actually gets people excited about war is the problem. There's a great scene in Jarhead. I really recommend this book. Anthony Swafford, Marine, writes about how he's training, getting ready for Kuwait for the first Gulf War, and the Marines watch Apocalypse Now, and they watch all the Vietnam War movies, and he says, now we're ready to drink and fuck and kill some motherfuckers and rape, and I show it to my students, and they're like, what? What? Can you say this in a book? But he's getting at the truth of anti-war movies. It's like you can have an anti-war movie and people will completely miss the point because they're enjoying watching the tanks get blown up and people getting shot.
And the craziness.
And that's what happens in Apocalypse Now, and that's what happens in the Hollywood cinema industrial complex. It doesn't, to some extent, matters what the story's about, but really what really matters is that you watch the damn movie, whatever it is. It could be a Transformers 7, it could be Apocalypse Now. The point is you're giving the cinema industrial complex the money, you're sitting in the seat, you're watching an American story about American people, even if they're doing doing bad things. The point is, everyone else is silenced. And that's what's happening in Apocalypse Now. That's what's happening in the Hollywood cinema industrial complex.
Let me try and squeeze in one more question before we turn to the audience for questions.
Yeah, sorry. Are we okay with the time?
I think, yes, it's 3:15. So,
I'm good.
We're
Yeah.
good? Okay.
Just, I don't watch.
So more and more we have books by writers of color being recognized, given accolades, awarded prizes, finding larger audiences. These events offer writers of color encouragement in an already competitive arena, but there still lies the matter of diversity in the publishing world. Who gets published and who decides to get published? Yet I know you've written about this. Or who doesn't get represented in the literary world? I'm thinking about queer and women writers of color. What is happening or not happening, or what would you like to see happening in terms of diversity in writers and books? And what do you consider to be the state of Asian American literature or American literature today? I know, it's big. So any of those, any or all.
Well, you talk about the military complex, entertainment, blah, blah, blah. Publishing is equally, and I think more challenging because they like to pride themselves on being, upstanding intellectuals, yada, 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 progressive. But if it's controlled by a certain establishment and, we're not cultural producers enough. That's the problem. There aren't any, you could probably count them all on one hand, how many editors there are of color. And in terms of people who own publishing, none.
Right.
I mean, there's small there's independent publishers around the country, but you're talking about the kind of success he's just had. I mean, I think you're a great example right now because you are here and they brought you to the festival and I'm like this, and it took this long for this voice. I mean, it's insane. Don't look at me like that. You're scaring me to death.
No, I think you're right. Stories themselves aren't enough. I mean, stories are really important. You need to have writers of color. You need to have stories that are quote unquote diverse. But that's important for changing the imagination, but that's just another phenomenon of colored faces in high places until you actually have a revolution where, you actually transform the means of production so that there's actually different kinds of people in charge of the means of production. You're not really going to have a transformation of social justice throughout society. And so authors and books can only do so much. We need to take over, or at least have a better equity of representation behind the scenes.
Yeah, because who chooses? Who chooses?
And so then the state of Asian American literature is that in the climate where diversity is a word that everybody understands, and we've, over the last few decades, Asian American writers have been getting more and more publishing opportunities and accomplishments and prizes and all that stuff. We're now a marketable niche. So actually to become an Asian American writer is not that big of a deal anymore. It was a big deal when you were getting published, when you could literally count a book every year or 2 years. And now it's like 50 books a year, right? So that's great. That's diversity. But as I said earlier, if Asian American literature is being written so that it's being written for the majority, then we actually simply have a case where we have diverse literature, but it's not really that important. Okay, so that unfortunately is true for a lot of Asian American books. So what needs to be done? You need to have Asian American writers who are actually going to be more worldly, who are going to be aware of the circumstances of how they're getting published. Just because you're getting a novel published about your family or whatever. I'm sorry, you're writing a memoir about your family. But that's we need to also just be much more aggressive and challenging towards power. And then not enough Asian American literature does that.
Right. Yeah. Follow-up question. So how can we change things so writers of color get published more? What needs to be done maybe on a grassroots or community level, or maybe an academic or the publishing level? Like you say, take over, like on a sort of like practical,
face it. I think the transformations in American society because of the 1965 Immigration Act, because of the Civil Rights Movement and so on, have benefited Asian Americans tremendously. So we see a lot of Asian American writers today because because we are the model, some of us are the model minority. Some of us went to engineering and into the medical school, and some of us went to get our MFAs in creative writing. And so that's also a function of the model minority phenomenon too. So I think we're doing fine. You know, we got writers' workshops that are for Asian Americans, we got this and that, you know. So we're getting people published.
Ooh, you are.
I'm sorry, am I going too far?
No,
Okay,
I
yeah.
love it. I love it.
Yeah.
So interesting.
But in terms of really making a transformation, you have to have Asian American editors and publishers and agents. We're going to do that too. I'm pretty sure we're going to do that because we're the model minority.
So, you know, I think he sort of said it in a way. It's kind of, what do you want? What was I was trying to think about, what are we fighting for? Is it just to be at the table, or is it to...
Which it seems like we are at the table, but then what?
Yeah, it's the then what. And I think, I don't know what else I could add to this. I think you pretty much covered it. It's kind of to constantly question. And so if you do get published, great, but then what? You know, it's really, it's the then what that is always in front of our face. And it's choices. It's choices of how you use your teeny bit of clout to either, you know, put a down payment on an apartment or help further some other better agenda perhaps, you know, it's kind of, what do you do in this moment? What's Viet gonna do in this moment? Besides speak up. You know, I mean, it's because he's in a very special moment. He's standing in the light. And we've all done that, you know, and it really does, it's a very interesting time, you know. And I know you're very aware of it, so, yeah.
Thank you both. Let's go ahead and open up for questions from the audience. And we have a few questions.
We can hear.
Hey, so Viet was my professor in undergrad. So Viet and Jessica, thank you so much for coming here and also for your wonderful novels. One thing I was curious about is what was the reception of your books within the Vietnamese and Vietnamese American communities and the Filipino American communities? Because both of your books talk about political issues that are sensitive, but in very nuanced, complex, ironic, and funny ways. And so I was wondering, what were the reactions? Was there any tension between like a sort of national or community pride of your works, and or like political disagreement? What kind of dialogue that produced?
I think you need to go first because it's immediate. I will think back.
Well, you know, when the novel came out, it got good reviews and everything like that, you know. But
You know, they're not reading the New York Times.
but you know, the
review.
community's not reading the New York
No.
Times and so on like that. But
They're
but, you know,
hearing about it.
Yeah. Well, they're not even reading the book. You know, they may read the New York Times. They'll go, oh, yeah, look at the cover, whatever. And you know, but the ones who actually read it, the response, at least to my face, was uniformly positive. You know, maybe they're saying something else. I'm pretty sure they were behind my back or in Vietnamese. But the response was from people who were older than me, who had lived through that time period, was like, "Oh, you got the fall of Saigon right. You got all this stuff right." And the younger people, my age and younger, were like, well, "Thank you for writing this book. You know, we needed this voice, and it's very powerful and moving, etc." Okay, all that is fine, but I knew that there were issues that the community had, because it's a very anti-communist community still here in the United States, and my protagonist is a communist spy, right? So then the novel wins the Pulitzer Prize, and everything is forgiven. everything is forgiven. It's like, no, seriously. I was like, people are like, we're so proud of you. You're such a, you're a credit to the entire Vietnamese people. And so, for example, when I won the Pulitzer Prize, I didn't tell my dad. I think I was like, the whole model minority thing is like, you don't go home with your report card when you get an A. You're like, whatever. You go home when you get an A- or a B+, right? So, oh, I'm sorry, I got an A- or a B+. So I won the Pulitzer Prize, and it literally did not occur to me to call my dad. Because I'm like, oh, of course. Of course. He calls me 2 days later on the road, and he says, the relatives in Vietnam called, you won the Pulitzer Prize. And he was so happy. I'd never heard him so happy in my life. But the point is that prize, an American prize, made such a huge difference to the Vietnamese American community and the people back in Vietnam. So here it is, cultural imperialism for both domestic and foreign relations. But the other interesting thing about Vietnam is that the unofficial media reported it. Viet Nguyen won the Pulitzer Prize. The state media said, somebody won a Pulitzer Prize. Yeah, they didn't use my name. Yeah. So that's why the translation issue is still going to be an interesting one in Vietnamese.
Wow. Well, my first novel was very controversial, but it also did bring a lot of people together. So it was controversial, really mainly because of the title. And no one, even people who loved the book, would come up to me and say, why'd you have to do that? You see, so I would have these, really interesting conversations with people about it and why I had to do that.
Why did you have to title it Dog Eaters?
Yeah, you could have the same book, but like that title is just so. And somebody said to me, that's what hurt me because it was so not that, and yet I thought, oh my God, I never thought of that's how they would think it. One person came up to me and said, was this a marketing choice by the white people? And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to kill myself. But I didn't, It was so not, it was the flip of the flip, and this flip almost flipped out. But I lived through it. And I have to say that there was, the feeling of that love and pride is something you'll never forget. And I think people really also felt like they finally had their moment, and that they were being discussed and they were discussing, and there were, a lot of public forums for everyone, and I think that everybody relished it. And like when I went back to San Francisco, the Phil-Am community, they were great. Everybody was reading it. So, and in the Philippines, it was very split. I mean, all my writer friends there told me what was going on. And the people I knew who would get it, got it. And then the others, and I totally understand that because I think, and I don't know if you're going to find this, but there's a feeling there are all these incredible writers there who write in English because it's still the preferred language, and that the older writers, that's what they do. They were taught to write in English, and they're not known in the world. Whereas the literature from the Caribbean or other island countries that have been colonized has been recognized. But those writers, don't you think, Laura, when you went there and had that controversial moment with the writers there, they look at you like, well, who do you think you are? So it's a really interesting tension. And one of the ways I tried to work with it was when I did my crime fiction anthology, and I chose, half the writers were from there and half were from here. It was supposed to be set there anyway, so they knew what they were doing. And it was a way for all of us to enjoy the moment together. But I totally get the resentment. I'm fine with it, resent me. I get it, and I can't control it. So,
The question over.
don't get me too excited. I'll start writing, and by the time I get to the doctor today, I'll be in an ambulance.
I'm going to go ahead.
Oh, really?
Okay. I'm teaching at BMCC. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of English, and I'm teaching Asian American literature too. When I was teaching Asian American literature, I had a moment with a great deal of internal conflict. What am I going to teach? What does it mean by Asian America, right? I think I don't want to, revisit the blues hanging controversy, but there is a great tension and dilemmas and contradiction between politics of representation of Asian American literature and aesthetical dimension of Asian America. So I think these tensions and conflicts and dilemmas are somehow evolved by and within ideological heterogeneity in Asian America. So my question is that to what extent, or do we really have Asian America? How do you deal with Asian America as a label? Somehow it's necessary, but at the same time we are resisting the label. Yeah. So how do you respond to that contradiction and dilemma?
Thank you, June.
It's a great question. Even in putting together the Charlie Chan anthology, it was a dilemma for me because, in particular, I think Filipinos are more Puerto Rican than anything, I always say, or Mexican. So it's a funny construct. I would love to hear, I don't have an answer for you. And I totally understood why everybody was pissed off with Lois Ann for that book. I defended her right to write it, But, people were really, really mad. But I'd love, you teach the literature, and you help fund our little reunion on your campus. What are your thoughts on the construct of Asian America?
Well, I became who I am intellectually and politically because of becoming an Asian American, so it's been very important to me, right? But yet at the same time, I've had a very ambivalent relationship to being Asian American because at a certain point, I felt that Asian American identity, as powerful as it is also very ideologically conformist. And so I think there's a necessity for Asian America and for Asian American studies, for example. That's why I'm a lifetime member of the Association for Asian American Studies, all right? But it's very contingent. And I think we need it so that we have classes at a place like this. It's still urgent to carry out this pedagogical and political work. We're still stigmatized in certain contexts by being Asian. So you need Asian American Coalition and Asian America.
Keep that conversation.
But you keep the conversation going because what I'm going to say is, at the same time, you have to criticize Asian Americans as well. Because now, for example, Asian America, as you said, is heterogeneous. It's changing. It's diverse. So now we have a new wave of Chinese Americans who are Chinese immigrants who, for example, support Donald Trump. Okay, are they Asian Americans or not? Okay.
Yes.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. Yeah. But a lot of other Asian Americans say, no, they're not Asian Americans because you have to be progressive to be Asian American. This is a very important conversation, right? So the point is that we have to be very critical of the very thing that gives us an identity, and it's not pertinent only to Asian Americans. I do this for Vietnamese Americans too. That's why I put a communist spy in a novel that is going to be read by a lot of people who are anti-communist, and that's why I made him half French and half Vietnamese instead of making him purely Vietnamese. We have to challenge the very identities that give us comfort, because if we don't, those identities are going to become deeply regressive and lead to a very contradictory kind of politics.
I also think that, we have to ask ourselves what literary fiction is meant to be, and it's not meant to comfort necessarily. It's meant to, bring up some questions and probably trouble people, and for the good, in a positive way, And I don't have an answer. I think it's a wonderful question that should just always be raised. I don't know if you'll ever find an answer for that, because it's not a neat world, and there are no neat little slots we can all fit into.
Hi.
Where are you? Oh, there you are.
I am here. Hello. I can't tell how loud this is, sorry. It's fine? Yeah, okay. I teach literature here. Thank you for being here. And my question is for Mr. Nguyen. Like you, I'm also from a country that flirted with communism. It's called the Soviet Union. And
I like your sense of humor already.
So on that note, actually, it kind of relates to my question. Anything I've read about you, the Sympathizer talk, it mentioned Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man as a kind of inspiration in tone and the narrator, and that's a very valid point. But of course, as you know, and maybe not enough of those writers do, the tone of that novel is inspired by Notes from Underground from Dostoevsky. And Ellison knew his Dostoevsky very well. So when I'm kind of in the beginning, less than 100 pages of your book, but I can already tell that it's very influenced, and correct me if I'm wrong, by Dostoevsky and even Gogol, who, of course, Dostoevsky owes a lot to. So my question is how, this is kind of the idea of coming to a language from a different perspective, from it not being your first language. So how did that either help or shape the voice and maybe allow you to, I don't know if be more experimental, if that's the right word, in the use of character and tone and voice, sense of humor, any of that stuff?
Well, I see myself as an American author, and I did my PhD in American literature, and so I really wanted to write a novel that would fit in the tradition of American literature and African American literature, which is why Ellison is so important to that. But I have a lot of problems with contemporary American literature, so I didn't actually want to write the great American novel. I decided I want to write the European version of the American novel, and which meant that and this is really to what you're saying, and I think it's important politically, theoretically, linguistically, to situate ourselves inside and outside of the United States, even as we're American writers. And so that meant reading writers who were not American. So going back to Ellison, tracing his genealogy to Dostoevsky, as you say. And when you get to the end of the novel, I think you're going to see shades of Brothers Karamazov there as well. But many other European writers were important to me at the same time because there's a different kind of a tradition there of literature engaging with politics and the absurd and the satirical and all of that. And so and I think turning to these non-American literary sources was an outcome of being someone who was Vietnamese and feeling like he was both inside and outside of the United States at the same time.
Oh, hi. I'm a student in BMCC, so I have a question for Jessica. My question is, what is it like to become a writer and breaking a what is it like to become a writer and breaking the stereotype of being a minority? And also, my question also is how is it difficult becoming a writer back in the Philippines due to circumstances and...
Okay, so I'll answer the first part of your question first.
Mm-hmm.
How is it to become a writer
that you broke stereotypes due to like being a minority in America?
And my big mouth.
Sorry.
No, don't apologize. It's all great. I have to say it's fun. Let's not forget the fun part. It's fun. When you start to realize nobody's gonna, it's okay to speak up and to be yourself and that you have no control over who will detest your work or who will love your work. And you just enjoy the fact that you get to meet all these different people every time you go on the road, I used to love, it's harder now because I'm older and I get so grumpy about travel. But back when, they used to send the writer out, they don't do it as much anymore. And so when they do, it means something, And I saw your tour list. I was like, okay, they're really supporting him. This is great. I mean, it's great because they don't do that for every writer. And so when you're out there all over America, I went to Iowa, for God's sake. Not many people showed up at the bookstore, but it was really, really interesting. Yeah, I'm really curious about people, so I love meeting all kinds of people. So for me, it was like being out there and just being exposed. And I thought it was fun, and it's fun for a woman to have that feeling, I think. So the people in the Philippines, tell me your question again. I want to make sure I understood.
How difficult it is to become a writer as a woman in the Philippines?
Well, I think it's difficult to become a writer in the Philippines, period, because our poor beleaguered country, it is, oh man, it breaks my heart what's going on there now. I just don't think literature is at the top of the concerns. I think it can be very dangerous. For example, I just got an email from a great writer in the Philippines who was giving a talk, who was asked to give a talk at the university recently in the Philippines. And he gave a talk on the violence that's going on now. And it's the kind of country where they could turn on you for that. So I thought of that reading what he had to say, because it was just so powerful and it was so real, and so it captured what's the madness that's going on there now. And in a beautiful, way, in a very painful and beautiful way. I mean, he expressed himself beautifully, which means it struck a chord, right? And I'm reading it on my phone on my way here, and I'm like, oh my God. So to ask about I don't even think that's the problem, how hard it is. It's like, boy, if you really said what was going on and enough people read it, listened, and cared, you could be in a lot of trouble. So in a way, literature could really matter there, but that's also a country, however, I want to clean this up, where you've got a very high number of people who are incredibly impoverished and are not able to read and write, very well. So literature is also for the elite. And it's unfortunate because it's a culture where poetry was once really sung and recited, and storytelling was very rich. And, right now I have to say, it's very hard. So the problems are different, okay? Who can afford to buy a book? Who can afford to buy a book? They cost so much money there. It's very intense. Yeah. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did.
I hope I didn't depress you. You should just write. No. You should just write if that's really.
I'm a literature major.
Yeah. Good.
I think we have time for one more question. So,
yeah.
2 minutes.
Hi.
Be careful, it's really hot stuff.
See that.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you both about writing outside your own cultural identity. I feel like writers, when they do that and it's good, have no problem, but are writers nowadays either getting better at that, like creating characters that they empathize with, whether they're part of their own people or outside their own people, or are writers and other artists afraid to do that today? There's that artist at the Whitney Biennial that was criticized for doing a portrait of the coffin of Emmett Till.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you guys feel about that? How do you put yourselves into the shoes of someone that's the other, and is that a big challenge?
Adonis says, I'm just going to quote him today, I am the other. I have the unpopular view of you should try to do that. If it's bad, it's your fault. If you screw that one up, take the blame, take the heat. But the novel we're talking about, Dream Jungle, was that I did not bring today, so we read from Dog Eaters, but it was the second half of it, which deals with the Apocalypse Now type movie. I wanted to get in the head of one of the actors. And I had a great time trying to figure that out. I didn't, and so I had written the first half, which was about this little girl, this little Filipino girl who becomes a servant in the house of a very rich man, and she's 9 years old. So it's all from that point of view. And then the second half is from this has-been Hollywood actor who is on the skids and is trying to make it back with this part. And I really, got into it. What does that mean? And I think it's a good muscle to work, and I think we should all do it. I mean, how can we live a life if we just, we're confined to writing about so-called what we know, and how dare we, what we know? I don't even know. I mean, she asked me about the Philippines, and I'm speaking for this country I no longer live in. So why is that any better, right? I live here,
Well, when I wrote The Refugees, I made a very deliberate choice that even though it was going to be mostly about Vietnamese people, that there would be non-Vietnamese people in it. And one story is written from an African-American veteran's point of view, and others written from a Latino man's point of view. And those were very deliberate choices, because I wanted to demonstrate, I think as Jessica is saying, that we can cross these types of borders and boundaries, and that minority writers or writers of color can speak from other people's perspectives, just as white writers have always done that as well. Now, the point is that we have to do it well. I mean, you just can't just...
You'd have to do it well anyway.
No, but if you do it badly, you have to take the blame, right? And then some writers do it badly, and then they get blamed, and they're like, oh, political correctness. No, it's like, you got to do your homework. So if I'm going to write about an African-American veteran, I should know the history, should know something about African-American culture, and I should think twice before I decide to say, before I have my African-American character refer to himself with a racial epithet. Okay, so maybe there's a reason for it, maybe there's not. You just can't do it because you think it's cool to do it, I don't do that in the story. But in other words, you have to do the homework, and you have to understand the ethical stakes that are present in an act of racial transgression or identification. So you can't do it. It's just a very serious thing to do. And I think that not enough people who decide that they're going to do that are aware of these ethical challenges and problems, and that the fact that there's a minefield out there isn't the fault of the other people. Right. It's the fact that it's a fault of history. And if you want to walk into the minefield, you can do it. You just got to be really, really careful about doing that.
And it sort of goes back to the original discussion about Coppola and what he was intending to make that movie, as a work of art, and how he failed in that one too. Not that all works of art are perfect, but he did by the most basic thing he ignored. The actual people who lived in the nation, right? So I think it's connected to that, being aware of the story you're trying to tell and the people in the landscape. Does that sort of address?
Sorry. Yeah, like I'm a teacher, and like I teach diversity of kids, and so if it's not my story, I still want to make that story relevant to them, and just being a white lady telling them the story, I want to do it justice, but I also, don't want artists and people to feel like they can't do that.
Right.
They can't put themselves out there.
Right. Well, I think our job is to put ourselves out there. If you don't take any risks, it's kind of dumb. That's the whole point of making art, is to take those chances and to take the heat too. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to end here with the Q&A. Would you please give our readers, our wonderful writers, Jessica Hagedorn and Viet Nguyen, another round of applause. Laura Stapleton, thank you very much for reading. And Sonia Linta, you're organizing. We are going to have a book signing now, so you still have an opportunity to talk to our authors, ask them questions. There are books for sale in the bookstore, and I know that Jessica has to skedaddle in about 10 minutes, so if you want to talk to her, you got to do it now. Thank you.
Wonderful conversation.